we're all set. Welcome everybody to the City of Salem Community Engagement Audit Steering Committee, formerly known as the Community Policing Audit Steering Committee. If you have more interest in that, in our meetings from our minutes from our last meeting, we talk about how that change of name came about and how we feel focusing on the community engagement really serves our needs going forward. For more information on the committee, the City of Salem website has minutes and information that talk about our scope of work, and we have been meeting since October. Congratulations for sticking in there and continuing to meet with us through fire, ice, and whatever else is thrown at us. So another challenging week for many here in town. So thank you very much for being here today. Courtney, would you mind please to call the order?
Yes, Jody, you are here. Anne Marie, I saw you join us.
Yes, I'm here, but I'm not turning on the camera because I don't have power. So.
Excellent, understood. And then Deputy Chief Burke.
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. Ashley Hamilton.
Yes, hello, I'm here. And I just want to make a note that I will have to leave at 5:30 today, unfortunately.
Thank you, Ashley. Levy Herrera.
Hi, everyone. I'm here.
Thank you, Levy. Has Kathleen joined us? I don't think so. Casey Copcho.
I'm present.
Thank you. All right, Cindy Linasar.
Good job, Courtney. I'm here.
Yay! And then Scotty Nowning.
Here.
Thank you. And Oni, has Oni joined us? Excellent. And then we have staff as well. I know I've seen Deb Aguilar, Gretchen Bennett, myself, Kristen Madigan, and Mark Weinstein are all here.
Great. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. So tonight's agenda, we are going to focus on our March information and dates that are key coming up in March. We will, if you haven't already, Courtney has sent out our minutes from January 14th. So if you'd like to take a look at those, and in just a moment, we'll entertain a motion to approve those. And we'll talk through a little bit more on our preliminary view of our findings and hear from steering committee members on what's been presented so far and our key themes and concepts, and also with Hilliard Hines staff. As I mentioned, on our agenda, we have 3 key dates that are coming up. March 11th, we again meet as a steering committee. March 15th is a joint work session with the City Council. We'll talk through expectations for joining that meeting. And then right after that presentation on March 15th, for March 16th, 17th, and 18th, there will be some community briefings. So we'll talk those through in a little bit more detail today. Does anybody have any questions or see something missing? I'm actually not at the bottom of my agenda page to see if there was something following. Doesn't look like it. Anything anyone was expecting to see or would like to comment on the agenda to get us started? Okay. So first on agenda, approval of our January 14th, 2021 minutes. And entertain a motion to approve those.
So move.
It's from Cindy, thank you. And a second.
I'll second. This is Casey.
Thank you, Casey. All those in favor of approving the minutes as is?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone not approving or abstaining? I'm not saying that right, but close. All right, great. So minutes are approved. Thank you very much for taking the time to read those and look at those. And again, to Courtney for putting those together. We have had, and actually I see Rob. Rob, did you have new staff member you wanted to introduce, or?
Yes, actually I have several on board with us.
Sunshine is in your face. It's a little hard for me to see you.
Oh, it's just
No,
that
I'm joking
time
about the sunshine here in Oregon. It would be great to see some of that. But.
Yeah, so I'm on the call as well, and but I also have one of our other vice presidents, Bob Bomer, who will be manning the PowerPoint presentation for us this evening. He also was there conducting, or was on doing virtual site visit, if you will, with the crowd control piece. You already know Ricky very well. I think Ricky Godey, fellow Oregonian up there now, but she's obviously joined us on the project and will be on this call as well as Brian Kaufman. Brian also is a fellow Oregonian now, and he will be assisting as well. He also was on the site, or on the virtual site visits. But actually, Brian actually made it to the to an actual site visit, was interviewing people there at the police department. And then you'll see on our slide that we've given credit to Bob Haas, who will not be on the call tonight. As you know, he retired, and we've been filling in for him to complete the project. But so there will be the 4 of us on the call tonight.
Great. Do you want me to kick it over to you to get started on the presentation?
Sure, happy to. And my apologies for the sun pouring through the window there. But you should have a PowerPoint up on the screen pretty soon, which should take care of the screenshot anyway. So I'll wait for Bob to load that up. All right, thank you, Bob, very much. As you well know, this is a performance assessment for how the community is being engaged by the Salem Police Department, their past community policing efforts, et cetera. And it really has been a pleasure for us to be able to work with you. All the feedback I've gotten from everyone that's been doing interviews have reported that it's just been an enjoyable experience. Everybody's been more than forthcoming with information. We appreciate that very much. It made our job a lot easier, and I think it also will help produce a better report that will help Salem moving forward. Next slide, Bob, if you would. Very briefly, the agenda that we have, at least for the PowerPoint presentation, we've already done an introduction, but we'd like to outline for you what our draft key findings are at this point. Remember, the report is still in its draft form. In fact, I conducted another interview myself with a Salem resident just today, a community member. So we're still finalizing these, but for all intents and purposes, what we will be sharing with you tonight are these high-level findings and recommendations for things that we think should be done. But that will be the point of the presentation tonight. We'll also talk about the organizational survey. Remember, we conducted an internal survey at Salem PD, and Bob Bomer will share information about that with you. We also have been reviewing and are incorporating into our report the information we learned from the Share Your Story project, where we encouraged, and the city encouraged, Salem residents to reach out and tell us their perspective of their interactions with the Salem Police Department, so that could also inform not only our findings, but the recommendations we could make that could impact or at least respond to those concerns that people raised through the Share Your Story. We'll conclude by presenting some of our high-level and draft recommendations at this point, and then open it up, obviously, for discussion. You may have several questions for what we present. So Bob, there you go. Now, Bob, next slide, if you would. So what did you ask us to do specifically? We would like to highlight the fact that you asked us to take a look at the policies, procedures, and interactions associated between the Salem Police Department and individuals who are unsheltered, those who are experiencing behavioral threat crises. You also asked us to take a look at how the police department is engaging with Salem's communities, with some particular attention being paid to the BIPOC communities that exist there within the community, as well as the LGBTQ plus community. We also took a look at how Salem PD has been responding to assemblies and crowds, illegal protests, lawful protests, as well as how they're using force and officer accountability issues. So those are all things that we have been focusing on as we have been conducting our assessment report. Remember, our assessment efforts have included meeting with a number of people, and we'll describe a little bit more in a moment. But what we really are doing are meeting with people virtually through a number of interviews, either one-on-one interviews, face-to-face, if you will, through the computer, and or focus groups with a variety of different people that represent the community as well as the department and the city. That's how we've gleaned most of our information. And we continue to drill down. One person might tell us something and we would learn about something from another person. They would recommend we talk to somebody else. They would recommend we talk to somebody else. We continued on that way. So what we're about to share with you is essentially what we found as a result of those types of assessment activities. So Ricky, maybe I could have you kick off and tell us a little bit about this particular component, since you were so heavily involved with this part of the report.
Sure. So as all of you know, we conducted a large number of interviews with community members. Some of them were one-on-one or in focus groups, but they included all of the agencies you see listed there: NAACP, Mano a Mano, the African American Pastors Group, Northwest Human Services, Salem Health Center, Center for Open Safety, Arches program, the host, the state youth homeless programs. And then we also, not listed up here, but we also included agencies and groups such as the business associations, all of the neighborhood association chairs, and school district leadership. Many of you on the steering committee were involved in that. Oni, Casey, Levi, Ashley, Cindy, you guys were a part of some of those focus group sessions. And I also want to give a thanks to Oni because she was very helpful in putting together a group of grassroots organizers, activists, and leaders. And there was a lot of excellent perspective gained from that meeting that we had. One thing I can tell you as a result of all of the community group is the heart and passion that so many in the community feel for the city of Salem. It came through loud and clear. And we all came away very impressed by the amount of pride and commitment that was shown and a lot of the excellent work that is being done already in the city. So as you all know from some of our previous meetings, these interviews helped develop some of the key concepts and themes that were identified early on. And you're going to be seeing those throughout areas of this performance assessment. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Rob.
Great. And just one other comment. Thank you so much, Ricky. One other thing I wanted to mention too is if one entity we did not mention is that there was a lot of interaction with members of the Human Rights Commission there. And in fact, I'm very appreciative to Gretchen. I reached out to Gretchen, who is the city representative who coordinates with that commission. And she was able to introduce me to several individuals within, for example, the LGBTQ plus community that I could reach out to a little bit more. So it went, we might meet with a certain group or something, but then we would do follow-up and meet with individuals to get even a deeper perspective of some of the issues and concerns that people within the Salem communities were expressing. So we want to thank Gretchen and others from the city that helped facilitate that. We also, aside from just meeting with the community, obviously we needed to meet with the police department. And that included really developing an understanding of what their current state is. You know, what is their mission, their mission and values statement? How have they been operating? What is their perspective? In other words, we tried to get a real-time snapshot of what's going on there in Salem so that we could compare and contrast what they're doing, what they've told us they would like to do, but also then comparing and contrasting that with what we know are best practices that are being practiced for a number of progressive agencies across the country. So that's what we've done. We've reviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of documents, policies, procedures, protocol sheets, et cetera, to try and learn exactly what they're doing, especially in these key areas. We also designed, disseminated, and analyzed an internal survey of SPD employees. I'm going to hold off for just a moment on giving details on that because Bob Bomer is prepared to give us more detail on that in a moment. But again, we asked for all these types of policies, we reviewed them, we've compared and contrasted, and then that's what's helped guide us to focus on what questions we needed to ask during the interviews, as well as helped us understand where we may need to go assist the agency as we did some research to determine where they may turn for additional references to help them as they're moving forward with a new strategic plan. Next slide, Bob, if you would. And as I previously mentioned, obviously this work involved a lot of interviews. I mean, it was well over 100 interviews conducted, might be approaching 200, but just a number of interviews with key personnel, both inside and outside the agency. We also obviously have been participating in the meetings with you so that we could be hearing some of your concerns and the issues that you have sitting where you sit, as well as taking a look at some of seeing how they match up, some of the things that you shared, how those match up with what we were hearing in the community meetings and in the one-on-ones that we were conducting. One thing that was very clear, I should point out, that we heard from the community, was they were very, very hopeful that the report that eventually comes out of this effort isn't just a report that states, okay, this is the policy that SPD has and here's what we recommend. They were very clear in a number of the focus groups we handled or conducted that they wanted to make sure that the community's voice was a part of what was being expressed as concerns within the report, and that their stories, if you will, were shared. And I can assure you, having been through the draft report dozens of times already myself working with our team, those views will be represented in writing within the report. So there should be no concern that the community has that their voice isn't being not only heard, but expressed and addressed within the findings and recommendations of the report. We also took a look at the current state of technology at SPD, specifically so we could determine whether or not they have the ability to analyze data in such a way that not only will it help them focus their resources more effectively, perhaps because they're being able to be smarter in terms of where they put their officers, but also in terms of ways that if they're approaching some of their work in the future through a multidisciplinary approach, where those hotspots might be, where they need to do those types of efforts, as well as just trying to determine whether or not they have the ability to share information with the community. So think about this, as we discuss some of the recommendations that we have, if an agency is trying to team up with community partners to address or impact social causes or social roots, if you will, of some issues, then they need to be able to share information with the community. And I think I spoke about this on a past meeting, but I'll share it again. Just to give you one example, if SPD has the ability to do a good job of tracking where crimes are occurring and being able to share that information, even with community partners, if there's a nonprofit agency out there that is focusing on something like domestic violence or sexual assaults in the home or child abuse or something like that, being able to share that type of information with community groups, social service organizations, nonprofits that are also committed to tackling that problem, it just is better for the entire community. And a lot of agencies historically have been a little reticent to share that type of information. So we really keyed in on looking at what is their data analysis capacity and what could they be doing to share that type of information moving forward so they can work hand in hand collaboratively with the community to address those key issues of concern. And then, as I stated earlier, also, we conducted a lot of research to try and make sure that we could pinpoint specific examples of things that Salem could consider doing as they read the report, see what our key findings are, and then try and move forward. Next slide, if you would, Bob.
And Rob, could I just stop for just a moment and thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I feel like you framed where we've been so well. I did want to mention to the steering team members that we are looking for feedback on the presentation that we're seeing here today. So maybe there are times throughout we can do some pause and look for some feedback on the presentation as we talk about going into March and presenting this to others. We want to make sure that it involves all of the areas that we've been discussing, the areas that we'd like to see and point out moving forward. So we are looking for that feedback as we go through the presentation. So I just want to make sure and say that.
Thank you very much, Jody. By all means, feel free to stop me anytime if you'd like to discuss it. And in fact, Jody, I'm glad you raised that issue also, because as we were prepping for the presentation a few hours ago, we noticed that in our slide, we did not mention the fact that we also looked at police accountability issues. You know, how is Salem PD taking a look at its internal affairs processes? And not only that, but we also know that because there's a Citizens Police Review Board, CPRB, that is sort of the civilian oversight component of what's being done there in Salem. You know, we also compared and contrast what they're doing there with what other possibilities may be to expand some of that ability for the agency to help, that board to be able to participate more proactively, et cetera. So that's one thing we've noticed that we've left off, that certainly when we get to the working group meeting later, that we will be back on the mix so that people see that that's in there. I can assure you that's in the report, the draft report as we speak. So I'm glad you raised that issue. That's one thing.
Thank you. I chair that group too, so it might have caught my eye. So so let's take a pause and go around the room. Does anybody have any points about the introduction that they'd like to make so far from what you've seen?
Jody, this is Casey, if I could.
Please.
Bob, if you could, in looking at the technology, I understand the scope of it. If I understand it correctly, rather, you assessed the capability to analyze data. Was there, and I know this was done fairly quickly as audits go, was there also a look at the data itself to see what kind, when, and how of the kind of data that was being captured?
Yes, great question. And in fact, what we've learned is that it wasn't that heavy of a lift, because we found that even though they're producing what you could consider to be the standard amount of data that's necessary, there really is not a robust data analysis process there. In fact, there are very few people that are really even focusing on that, except when they're asked to do that. Very progressive agencies have a process where personnel within the department, that's their full-time job. They're constantly processing that. And you could say, well, just, how many people do you put on something like that in a city the size of Salem? Well, remember, there are so many benefits that come from that data analysis or the data that's produced that you work smarter. In other words, it's much better to take 1 or 2 people and put them into that process, because you're going to save all kinds of time at the other end if they're using their data correctly. So we found that the data, the processes for doing it really need to be looked at. I think in our discussions with new officials there at the police department, your chief and others, that there's also a recognition of this. And so when you ask what's the current state of the data, is very minimal in terms of what they're producing to even help internally, let alone what they're would like to help with externally. So, you know, we'll be recommending them types of programs they could be using, things that they could be doing, as well as sharing with them some examples of agencies that do it very, very well, that are similarly situated as Salem. So they could easily say, okay, I get it. If we could do X, Y, or Z, and they could see the end product, it makes it much easier for them to envision what they could be doing. But it's just, it wasn't a heavy lift for us because there really wasn't a lot to look at, if you follow me.
Great, thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you both. Anybody else? Please don't hesitate to raise your hand or unmute and raise your voice, because I can't necessarily see everybody, so I want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. I did want to mention on the slide where you listed the group names, if there's a way we can be more inclusive with the group names. I know folks are going to look for themselves in there, and for example, the neighborhood association groups weren't listed, but you mentioned it. Thank you, Ricky. And I know that that was such a good conversation, so I just want to make sure if we could call out.
We were just concerned with putting too many slides with the names up there, but if it's important, and I can obviously see the value of it, we're happy to do that.
I think it's a great story to tell, especially if someone just looks at the presentation without the context of the speaking. So
sure, and it wasn't just groups. I think what would be important also, Chair, to put on there the fact that we also spoke with individuals from certain groups within the community. For example, you know, our outreach to some of the members of the LGBTQ community. It may not have been a formal organization, but it would be important for someone to see that indeed we did reach out. And that was one of the great conversations I had today with the Salem community members. So we'll do that. I appreciate the feedback on it.
Thank you. And I'll go back to mute. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Great questions. So one of the things that jumps out immediately is the fact that SPD does not have a formal written community policing strategic plan. In fact, if you take a look at their overall strategy for the entire department, people recognized quickly that that's missing. In other words, it's very, very hard to drive a strategy if you don't have a plan. I think I'm stating the obvious here, but it's also important that the rank and file see that. You know, the sergeants at that street level need to know exactly what the priorities are for their shift, for their time of day they're working, that type of thing. You know, what exactly is expected of a detective? Is a detective doing nothing but showing up from 8 to 5 and handling cases, or does that detective understand that an important component of their job is to also reach out and figure out who in the community can help collaborate with them to address the types of crimes that they're investigating? So a strategic plan will certainly help do that, not only for the department itself overall, but a very specific one focused on written community policing, or written processes for how they're going to do their community engagement. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment when we speak about some of the things we learned from the community interviews. Another thing, the second point here, is that while they're engaging in some very promising operational activities as a police department, it's not to say they haven't been doing good things. In fact, a lot of people in some of these community groups mentioned some of the very things that they liked about what the department was doing. But the complaint that we got also was sometimes that came off as being somewhat superficial. For example, we heard from some members of the African-American community that they had a great relationship. They spoke very highly of the relationship they had with the leaders of the police department. But there was a sense that sometimes they get together and they have a push for things that they could be doing, then it kind of falls off a little bit because there's no strategy that's holding them to account for the things that they would like to be able to push forward in tandem with the community. And those community members were very clear that they're more than willing to roll up their sleeves and put their shoulders to the wheel and push, if you will, with the police department if they're asked and if there's really movement going forward. They don't want to just feel like this is a report that, you know, people point a few things out and then it goes away. They really want to be proactively engaged in very specific things that they're doing with the police department. And I think that things would go much better. So that's part of what you're going to hear from the recommendations. That takes us to that third bullet, essentially. And the members of the BIPOC community had some very nice things to say about the police department and some of their activities. But again, they want more formal, almost memorandum of understanding type of an agreement with the police department. Here's what we'll do if you'll do this, and here's where we can get some funding perhaps. and we'll move forward. In our report, we will be providing examples of cities that have done that, going so far as to create memorandums of agreement with a variety of external community entities. And even, in fact, some cities have even provided some levels of funding to these individuals, groups, to try and help collaborate with the police department to affect some of the changes within the community that drive some of the crime or social disorder that may be taking place. We also heard that the police department doesn't have a lot of robust youth-based outreach programs. Again, there are some things that are being done, but so many people said that they just felt like there needed to be more engagement with the police, with their youth, so that the youth understand who those police are and what they're really trying to accomplish, and not just the guys out there trying to catch you doing something wrong. They're the individuals out there trying to help you succeed in the things that you would like to accomplish, not only as a youth, but in the community as a whole. So we also heard loud and clearly that there are serious concerns about the SRO programs, the school resource officers programs in the schools. And it's really unfortunate because we heard loud and clear the concerns, and there are legitimate concerns that the community members have about how the SRO program is running. I get there's one thing you could say that creates this problem is that the national model for how school resource officers should be operating is that they're really a resource within that school. Their primary function should not be investigations. But it appears that what's happening is that because SPD is so short-staffed, that a lot of that detective work has been turned over to the school resource officers when that work involves perhaps some of the kids that are within any given school. So rather than having that school resource officer serve as a mentor and as a guide and somebody that the kids in the school look up to and want to interact with, they fear the person because he's the one doing the investigations. They're putting a kid in handcuffs. They're putting their buddy in handcuffs. So there's some significant work that needs to be done if that SRO program is to work the way that it could work, the way that we believe would be most beneficial, but also in a way that the citizens there in Salem, the parents, especially in Salem, would be comfortable and with that program and recognize what the values could be if it was run well. Next slide. And I'll pause for a moment if anybody has any questions on this slide we just covered.
Yeah.
Question.
Question. I'm sorry.
Sorry, DC. I had a question about the SRO. Were you looking at it only from the Salem Police Department side of things, or is there an MOU or a MOA with the school district? Did you look at a contract? Did you see things like that, or was it really more of an engagement with students and parents and things like that?
Ricky, would you like to speak to that one?
Yes, it's a great question, Cindy. We looked at the MOU, and I had a really good conversation in a group meeting with all of the school district leadership, including the superintendent, as well as I had a focus group with the SROs from Salem Police Department themselves. So got a lot of perspective about the school resource organization from a 360 degree, as well as obviously heard a lot about it from community members as well.
And that goes right back to Jody's point a moment ago. We should make sure that the schools are represented in that community outreach piece as well, so people recognize that. So I'm taking notes.
I had them in my notes.
This is Anne Marie, and one of my observations on that previous slide was just positive around the strategic plan, because I believe that a strategic plan would create more consistent response from the officers. Right now, we will try and find out who's on so that we can talk with somebody who knows about behavioral health or who knows what the most recent laws are and won't argue with us when we're trying to get our work done or we need their help. And so I really like the idea of a strategic plan that will really make sure that the information is consistent from officer to officer.
And I'm glad you brought that up and made that statement, because I'll tell you, everything that I'm getting feedback from Brian and Ricky and Bob Haas, I've spent a lot of time with Bob Haas and have been reading through all of his notes, but also speaking with him directly. Make no mistake, you've got great people that work at Salem Police Department. And there are any number of people there who expressed a desire to be able to move this forward. Any number of them have visions of how this could be working. There just needs to be a coordinated strategy for how they could move forward with this new vision in mind. So I hope we're not painting a picture that for some reason, SPD is just this agency that's been sitting around and, isn't doing good things. I think they just kind of been jolted a little bit to realize, it's a point in time. There's a watershed moment in law enforcement going on right now. And we really need to rethink what we're doing. But having said that, again, I just want to underscore that it's not that you don't have people there who can't do it. And my interaction and the interaction of our team members so far with your new chief have left us to believe that there's no reason why you can't be successful moving forward. In fact, I'll go out on a limb here. I'll tell you, I'd be highly surprised if within the next 5 years, we're not recommending to our clients that they look up Salem to see what they've been doing the last 5 years, because we have very high hopes for the success that community is going to experience as they try these new things. So I just want to say that because I don't want to paint a picture that for some reason we're saying good things aren't there, that they don't have the capacity to do it.
So Bob, my only question is, as we're going through this, are these the actual recommended findings at this point based on all the input and your impressions and your findings, or is this that you're talking about right now is this just input that you're hearing and your findings are going to look different, or is this just?
No, findings are not going to look much different. There may be a few additional. One thing I should point out, these are high-level findings. We may, for example, talk about the strategic plan and say that's, we've said that's a finding and we're recommending that they have one. But in our report, you may find that in that section, we have that as a major finding, but there may be 6, 7, 8 more specific recommendations, but they're all geared towards what you're seeing on the screen. Just perhaps a little bit more specificity for some. And sometimes sometimes we're actually making them so that they're measurable type of recommendations, something they could be doing where they could measure over time how effective they've been. But for all intents and purposes, it's not going to change. The recommendations are not going to change too much from what you're seeing on the screen, just more detail. Does that make sense?
Can I follow up with that? This is Casey. I'll turn my camera back on, trying to do a lot of things here. All right. When you speak to the recommendations, so just so I'm clear, we'll have a lot more of, the SMART style recommendations, specific, measurable, timely, all of that kind of good stuff. So that way, my hope that I see when I hear strategic plan and I think of these recommendations, since we don't, as a committee, have necessarily any teeth or to enforce the recommendations, at least there could be some accountability to if there are specific measurable actions that we could follow up within a year, say, or whenever that time comes, and say, well, how did we do? Here's what we wanted to do. How well are we tracking on these things? And that's something that we'll be able to hopefully take away from this.
I think you'll find that to be the case. In fact, most cities, when we leave, they will take our recommendations. Say we've got 9 sections, and for each section there's a key finding, and then maybe 8 recommendations. Typically, what the cities do is they will take those recommendations. They're numbered, like section 1, recommendation 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and they'll take those and they'll plug them into some type of a case management or a project management type system, software system, and actually assign people the task for addressing that recommendation. They say, okay, here's what the recommendation says. Here's what we need to do to be able to do it. Here's who's going to own it, who the champion will be. And here's some time periods for both short-term, mid-term, long-term things will have to happen for us to be able to declare victory for that recommendation. So we hope that they're seeing our recommendations as being components of that strategic plan that they can actually use as they figure out that larger plan and move forward. So to your point, we hope that they use it that way.
Thanks.
No? I'll go ahead and continue on. One thing that jumped out also, not only internally, in fact, interestingly enough, I hope people understand that we heard this also from people inside the department as much as we heard it from outside. But there is a need to increase the strategy for recruiting, testing, hiring, backgrounding, promoting individuals even that are already there who have diverse backgrounds and who are more representative of the city. And we also learned, as I noted before, that any number of your community groups and your community leaders have committed, they've told us, look, if they're willing to work with us, one individual put it like this, and in fact, I think we even quoted it in the report. If they're willing to work with us, we're willing to work with them. And they're ready to get down to business in terms of this. So this is not just in Salem. Remember, this is an issue that's taking place across the country right now, because recruiting is it's on the top 10 list for every single chief across this country. There's competition out there for quality recruits, and it's very difficult to convince young people to join police departments right now because of the way that police are being viewed in so many communities. But when you have the community step forward and say, we will help you do that, you're already on the path to success. So there's a significant section that talks about some of the things that they could be doing to try and impact that. We already spoke to this a little bit, so I won't go into too much greater detail, but there's not a robust process for collecting and analyzing that data. And it doesn't have to be a super heavy lift to be able to be successful at this. So we will also hope that what the people at the police department are hearing from us is that, you don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. We've got similarly situated cities like Salem that are successful at this, and they can look for examples of either software programs, it doesn't have to be expensive stuff, of things that they could be doing in training courses that they could go to, and then examples of what type of information is actually being shared with the rank and file on a day-to-day basis to help them, be more effective on their day-to-day operations. Being able to pick up a sheet to see what types of crimes have happened in the last 24 hours in your area is certainly more helpful than just kind of saying, hey, we think there's a burglary problem. To see hot spots and where they should be working, to know what specific communities are taking place in, and then knowing what community groups are in those community areas, who they could work with to try and address those issues. So again, I won't beat that particular point to death, but there's some significant work that needs to be done there. We also know that there were some significant challenges in responding to the protests that occurred in May, as there was in just about every single city across this country. So Bob Bomer and Chad McGinty were doing the site assessment work on that particular piece, and you will find within the report recommendations for how they could be more effective using the National Incident Command System, the ICS program, amongst other things. Also, the Share Your Story effort is tied into this crowd control issue and the protest issue, because so many of those individuals expressed concerns or stories, if you will, about the way that they felt like they were treated by the police department, particularly as they saw it, their perception for how other groups were being treated. So that was also a highlight of some of the things we heard from that. But within the report, Bob, in fact, in a moment, he's going to give you more detail on it. But the Share Your Story information really also helped us frame our findings within the crowd control piece. Next slide. In fact, I'll turn it over to Bob right now, and he'll take us through both the internal survey piece as well as that Share Your Story component of the assessment.
Can I interrupt real quick and ask a question?
Sure.
On your key findings, was it not a key finding that our 1.1-ish per thousand is a key factor in so many things? I mean, it's less than national. I know that the numbers can mean a lot depending on a lot of things in your community, but I think everyone would agree that 1.1 per thousand police officers, you have officers with lots of ideas, you have supervisors and managers with lots of ideas, but ideas usually come with personnel. And so to see all these things that we could be doing, but it's not a key finding that we're gravely understaffed, that's concerning to me that didn't stick out somewhere in this.
Is it Scotty?
Scotty, yeah.
Great question, because the report actually does highlight that, and it's just that we didn't have that on the slide deck. So great feedback, because we'll see to it that along with these other things that have already been mentioned, we'll get that on there. But there's no question that they're short-staffed. I alluded to it a moment ago when we were talking about how the SROs are being tasked with the responsibility of conducting detective work. Look, there has been no significant increase in that police department in going on 10 years. And there's no question. I mean, every agency we go to is going to tell us that they're not staffed highly enough. Everybody says that. But you can tell when there's an agency that's really in crisis with staffing and when there's not. And there's no question to us that there's a staffing issue at Salem. So that's really a key thing that the city council will need to understand, that if they want to move forward with more of these multidisciplinary approaches to policing, whether they're interacting with people who are unsheltered or individuals experiencing behavioral threat crises, or even more engagement within the BIPOC community, they've got to have free patrol time. I think the way free patrol time is the same thing as what that means is that's the time when a patrol officer is on the street or detective is doing work when he or she is not required to respond to a call for service. Most agencies shoot for about a 40% free patrol time. And that's not the case in Salem. So, they won't be able to do a lot of these things if they don't have the ability to drop that amount of time when they're bouncing from call to call so they can engage the community. So I appreciate you raising that issue, Scotty. We'll make sure it's highlighted in the PowerPoint presentation for the next session, but be aware that it is a strong section within the report itself.
Okay, thank you.
Bob Barmer, want to take us through this?
Sure, thanks. You know, one of the things we did was the internal survey of staff, including sworn personnel and civilian personnel. And the survey had about 44 questions, was open for a few weeks to give people a chance to respond. And actually, it was a really good response. When you have 111 sworn and 22 civilian personnel, that's a really good response rate. Sometimes we don't get that kind of response. So I think that was positive. You know, the questions covered lots of things from general questions about the organization, questions about supervision, questions about whether the officers feel adequately trained, and some questions about the relationship with the community and community policing type topics. So we're not going to be able to go through every one of those today. The report's going to highlight a lot of details, but I want to pull out a couple highlights just to look at it. And it's kind of interesting as you look at the generally pretty positive internally. People feel like they're treated with respect. Departments promotes diversity, and it's an inclusive workplace. Very positive impressions there. As you move on again, this is one of these measures of satisfaction that most agree that their supervisors gives them regular feedback on their quality of work. The civilian employees reported a little bit less, but generally still high marks on getting feedback. I think one of the interesting things that came out of this, though, is as you look at the impressions of the morale in the department, is despite seeing those numbers of I'm treated with respect, people like me, my supervisor gives me feedback, all those kind of issues, you would think leads towards high morale. And you see the sworn personnel, only 20% of the current personnel, the sworn personnel feel that the morale is high in the department. That's pretty significant. And we haven't been able to dive in too much on why that is, but you can see some of that on the organizational issues could be addressed. And part of it, you know, during the survey, it's a sign of the times. What police officers read about what's happening with policing through the country and some of the issues that are in Salem. It might be a reflection of also kind of what they're hearing from the community as well. It's something to keep an eye on. But 60% of the civilians, so 3/5 of the civilians do believe that morale is high.
Bob, before you move on from that slide, I'll just weigh in that it may very well be that low number of 20% is not just as that they're feeling low morale within Salem, but it could also be associated with what they think communities nationwide are thinking of police departments. That they're just kind of, I mean, a lot of people are in the dumps a little bit right now because they feel like they're not being respected or people aren't understanding their job. So it's hard just by the questions that were asked or how they were responding to know exactly what degree of that is part of that 20%.
I think you're right, Rob, that some of that is definitely driven by the national narrative. Of course, with the survey, it's impossible to know that, but I suspect that some of it's driven by that national narrative.
Yeah,
and also,
just
go
to
ahead.
follow up really quickly, I'm wondering, and I guess it's too late now that the survey's been done. I was just wondering, how do you divide that out, and how do you ask the question of whether that low morale is driven from external forces or internal? And now that we've already done it, it's probably, I mean, obviously it's too late to ask that. But.
Yeah, it's a great point, Chief. But I think the thing is, what it does is it tells the new chief and his command staff that because of that number, they really have to make sure that they're managing the message in their agency. In other words, part of their task is to recognize what that number is and to figure out why it is 20%. You know, is it just because people are feeling that outside sentiment, you know, bleeding in a little bit, or are there some specific things that they'd like to talk more about? So in other words, yeah, it would be nice to have perhaps a more robust understanding of why that's so low there. But I think it does serve well to prompt the chief to figure out why that is and let him and his staff get in there and address that issue, which I don't necessarily should be having. I think some of that too, to be candid, based upon the reviews that I've been doing, is it could very well be that their morale is a little bit low because they would like to be doing more of the very things that you're talking about wanting to do, but there hasn't necessarily been a formal game plan to the extent they may have liked it to be done. So that may be playing into it as well. Now,
I was just gonna, I don't know.
Go Go ahead,
I was
Ricky.
just gonna add that I think there could be a combination, because to Scotty's point, in a lot of the interviews, obviously I spoke to many people within the Salem Police Department. And I think that Rob's point about them not being able to do some of the things that they'd like to do in the community, it's all kind of part and parcel to that staffing issue we were talking about a little bit earlier, because I think it's a combination of definitely the sentiment that's being felt nationwide among police officers, but also some of the things that are very germane to Salem Police Department, which is they are going call to call and are low staffed, and that is addressed in the report. But I think it could be a combination of all of that.
Oh,
Yeah,
Ricky, oh, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
No, Ricky, that's a great point, and I don't have a slide for this, but later on in the survey, there was a question of whether they felt that the Salem residents trusted them as police officers, and how they trusted the Salem Police Department. The numbers were very high. They were in the 90s that officers were responding to saying, I feel like the community residents trust me as an officer, and slightly less, but still a high number, probably around 90, was that I feel like the community trusts us as a department. So when you start looking at all those trust numbers and everything else, it tells you there's a little bit more of the story. And maybe, Ricky, like you said, with the understaffing, you're just running call to call, and you can't do these community engagement activities that they'd rather do.
And that gets back to the community policing part we were talking about earlier. Put yourself in the boots of an officer out there. You've got a man or a woman out there that's trying to do a great job of delivering policing services to Salem. Yet, as Ricky stated, when they're bouncing from call to call to call to call, and then there's criticism coming in that the police department isn't doing enough to be innovative with these, multidisciplinary approaches, et cetera, you can very well see that if you're great people, they're kind of going, folks, I'd love to be able to do that stuff. And that's part of the pressure, I think, that you're feeling in some of this as well. So
Bob, a question centered around that is, as we go through this report, is there anything in here that's going to highlight the things that we are doing that maybe we should have other people doing? In other words, are there calls for service? Are there things that law enforcement's being asked to do that really isn't a law enforcement function, and a recommendation as to where that would be driven?
Well, yes, you're going to find that in, we address some of the ways to do a multidisciplinary approach to the very items that are important to this study. The interactions with the BIPOC community, interactions with the people exhibiting behavioral threat crises, individuals that are unsheltered. Clearly, there are multidisciplinary ways of approaching that, which, if done well, could do two things. It could obviously reduce some of the issues, but also share that load with the rest of the people in the community that also have subject matter expertise in that area. That in and of itself could help take some of the pressure off the demands for the calls for service, or the amount of time that the officers need to be spent doing that, if it's a shared responsibility within the community with some other entities. All of the entities we spoke with, think of the ones we had on our list here, Salem Health Care and Pacific Northwest, I believe was the name of one. They're already run types of programs. All of them were expressing ways that they thought they could be doing more. So yeah, there are various examples of things we've tried to share for how it is that some of the things that you're currently doing that you perhaps shouldn't be doing could be addressed. One other thing I wanted to mention from a prior slide there too was there was a really high number of people within the department that said that they didn't feel like there were any problems with diversity. But when you take a look at the diversity of the department, I scratch my head a little bit thinking, well, if it's not really diverse, are they just giving an answer like that because they personally don't feel like they've ever had an issue with that? And of course, if you don't have a lot of diversity in your department, that might very well be your answer because nobody's sensing it. If it was a more diverse department, there may be more issues that were raised with that. So if I'm the chief and one of his command staff members, I'd really be looking at that number two saying, are people understanding, however, within the department, the needs and the reasons for wanting to diversify and how beneficial that could be. So again, there could be a lot of interpretations on that, but that would be one thing I would take out of it if I was the chief there. Bob, you want to hit the next slide?
Sure. So this is the share your story piece, and we did a community sentiment analysis of this, and I'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, we started out with, I think the piece we saw, there were 140 responses. Once you started cleaning out those responses, there were some blank responses, some responses that had just random letters in it and things like that. But we came down to having 119 substantive responses. 18 of those were positive, 98 were negative, and 3 we kind of ranked as they had both positive information and negative information. Again, on the share your stories, the nature of a share your story kind of thing is probably going to get more negative responses anyhow. Well, let me go back to this a second. And you know, as we looked at the negative responses, of those 98, 49 of them, so half, were about the protest and about disparate treatment of different types of groups at the protests. That was the biggest concern. The biggest story we saw was somebody saying, we attended the protest, went downtown, and we saw this group being kind of allowed to do what they want, and this other group was treated differently in kind of more enforcement actions versus more officers talking to them. That was probably the biggest response on there. The second one was they discussed profiling, harassment, or some sort of inequitable service, and about 25 of those respondents talked about that. And then the rest of it was a little mixed, general service kind of complaints, some long, which we'd expect on these really long complaints about lots and lots of issues, which were really hard to categorize. And 3 that complimented police departments in some ways, and then were critical of the department in other ways. So it was kind of a mix, and we'll go into some of the more of the detail on that in the report, but that's the general tenor of that. So why don't we hesitate for a second on that as well, to see if there's anybody else who wants to ask about that. Okay.
Is that a pretty standard percentage of, I mean, I guess it looks bad when you look at the ratio 98 to 18, but we do have 170 some odd thousand residents. So is that compared to a normal sized city? Is this about what you would expect? Is this a lot more? Is this a lot less? What's, I guess, the normal in your experience doing these?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, you know, but generally when these share your story kind of things are put out in general, it does attract people that had particular complaints or concerns about the department. And it doesn't necessarily attract people to say, I just want to say some good things about the department. Although I would say 18 people did say very positive things about the vision of the professionalism of the department, and specific incidents where department members went out of their way to help. There was a story about somebody's son who was in a crisis, and the officer was calm, addressed the son, helped the son kind of calm down and de-escalate, and they were able to get services to that son. Those kind of stories showed up where people were really positively impacted by the department.
I will say this though, and that is that if you take the numbers and put those into statistics, I mean, 18 positive responses, really 21, because it was positive information along with negative, with some people, so they were trying to be very objective. For that number of responses, my experience has been that in most of the surveys we do, the overwhelming majority of people have negative responses because it's more of that attitude of, you know, I'm going to give the police department a piece of my mind, or some people are looking at the police department, I'm going to give them a piece of my mind kind of thing. I actually think that the positive responses are higher percentage-wise based upon the total N number, if you will, than we would normally see. I've had surveys that were probably maybe 3 times the amount of responses there, but maybe had 20 positive responses. So my point being, my experience has been that that's probably a higher number of positive responses based upon that 119 number than you would normally see.
Yeah, and this kind of thing, when you're asking for these kind of stories and narratives, it's not really as much of a scientific thing as it is to just get a picture of, at a certain point in time, from a certain amount of people, of what they think. It's a kind of a measure, you know, obviously when you see almost 50 people talking about the protest, there's a buzz about that, but this is not the only place you've heard about the protests from the Share the Story. So you know that's a big issue. So it bubbled up in this as well, but it's no way would it be, I would use it as some sort of scientific piece as much as a demonstration of what some people are saying.
A good discussion, a good question, Scotty. I think for me, and thanks to Casey for the idea for this, but just giving folks an opportunity to be able to have an outlet for information they wanted to share if they were not part of the groups was what this is about. So I think losing that scientific measurement and calculations does kind of come through. But yeah, thank you for recognizing these in the slides as well.
When we want appropriate, the report also appropriately, I mean, we want to also make sure that those people that shared their story were heard. So we're not going to put everybody's stories in the report, but the fact that we're able to read them and gather some sort of input from them, I think is going to be important to the people that look at this too.
And do you expect, as we have community forums, this conversation will grow somewhat as we are out and about talking more about the findings, and folks will again have their opportunity to give their stories. So.
Yeah, I think that would be typical. Yeah.
Sorry, this is Courtney. If I could just interject for a moment. Thank you, Jody, for the question. I think it's our intent to finalize the report after we've made the community briefings in the end of March. So this is sort of similar to how I think, Rob, you were characterizing the beginnings of this work as we visited with community groups, and it spawned further conversation with individuals and other community groups. It's the same, I hope, through this conversation as we're talking about the findings and the recommendations, that they will build and be refined as we go in this last bit here through the end of this month, or excuse me, next month.
Yeah, we think it's important to make sure that is all included, because this report will, to our prior point, be used as kind of the benchmark for the chief and the agency as they move, in the city and the community as they move forward to try and address the questions that have been raised through this assessment, and perhaps, you know, outline some of the strategies. But it needs to be codified, if you want. It needs to be documented in here. So we're more than happy to you know, if there's something that pops up, if there's a theme that we have not heard from our work, that could certainly be incorporated into the narrative. I realize one of your members who's getting ready to leave, so we'll make a real quick comment, and that is, we're going to just cover a few or about 3 slides worth of the recommendations we have, but the overwhelming majority of the findings we've already mentioned. We've already alluded to most of these recommendations. So for the person who has to leave early, please don't think you're going to be missing some key things, because I think we've covered a lot of that through that. Make sense?
Thank you for pointing that out. Any questions before you go, Ashley, or did you already go? Oh, there you are.
No, I'm still here. No, this was a really, really helpful, and I look forward to seeing the report as it manifests over time. The questions that I did have were asked by the panelists already, so this is good.
Thank you, Ashley. And Cindy, I saw your hand raised, so I don't want to miss the opportunity.
I think the opportunity for our community to share the story was a great idea. The question that I have, I guess it's kind of twofold. As you've been talking about this, it's kind of, there's categories for which different stories were in a topic area. So will you be highlighting topic areas as suggestions? And then beside that, the city does do a community engagement strategy every year about asking different qualities of service for lots of different city departments. And the department, I believe in, Courtney, do you do this, or does, or Gretchen, are you involved in, I think I've seen somewhere between that 80% Salem police as positively viewed. So did you take a chance to look at any other city surveys when it related to policing and engagement and positive or negative from that longitudinal type of data?
I would have Bob weigh in on this one, not that I'm aware, because remember, what we're trying to do is get a snapshot in time. I'm not sure how often they do those other surveys, or if there's a recent one, if you do them annually or something, but ours is like a snapshot in time.
Rob, sorry, this is Courtney. And early on, I did share the findings, and the survey that Cindy's speaking to is it's a statistically valid poll that we do on an annual basis. We try to run it in September to avoid election fatigue. And we have been hovering, as she quoted correctly, very high in the public safety numbers. It was in this September, however, that we separated out police response from fire and emergency services because we felt that would be an important look as the nationwide conversations have really changed, including here in Oregon and in Salem. And so the numbers did slip a little bit when we separated out, and I believe they were in the high 70s, but I'll make sure while I'm offline here and just talk about that at the end of our conversation today.
And also to the chair's point a moment ago, in our draft report, you will find that we've done just what you were suggesting. Bob Bomer has kind of taken the just share your story pieces and broken it down into themes. And those themes he's identified and will actually have the number of the just share your stories that fit into those themes, such as the complaints were about dealing with the homeless, or the complaints may have been about an illegal search, or somebody that was experiencing a behavioral threat crisis, or somebody who observed something like that. So they've broken these themes down and then have the numbers of the responses listed next to it.
You know, an interesting that came out too on the share your stories, which I was surprised that I didn't see as many stories about homeless issues as I know kind of some of the focus of what you're looking at as Salem. And there were only a handful of responses that either talked negatively or positively about issues regarding the homeless. I thought that was pretty interesting, considering all the dialogue that's been going on.
In fact, out of the 119 responses, five were about the homeless.
All right.
All right, Bob, next slide, if you will. So again, and I'm trying to be very, very cognizant of your time as well. We want to make sure we're leaving time for your meeting to ask questions if you haven't already asked them. But so the ones we've already talked about, I'll hit on very, very briefly. They need a written, formal community policing strategic plan that, in our opinion, also includes reaching out, perhaps having some memorandums of understanding, MOUs with community groups. Clearly, there's opportunities for multidisciplinary responses to a variety of different things, services that they're providing right now that could both lighten the load for the police department, but as well as increase the level of proficiency for how they're responding to these individuals that are either suffering, unsheltered situations or et cetera. And remember, it's not that they've just been sitting on their hands there at SPD. I mean, I'm familiar with work that's being done by somebody on your very committee here who has been looking at ways that other agencies in Oregon have been doing these things and already discussing those types of things. It's just a matter of taking that, moving it forward, quantifying it. Clearly, the third bullet there, this is kind of an overhead statement about what needs to occur. And that is, I alluded to it earlier, that people need to remember, if you're serving on a police department, it doesn't matter what your job is. Community policing or community engagement is not just for patrol. It's for everybody in the department. I could be a detective, and it's just as important for me as a detective to understand how I can be engaging and collaborating with the community as it is that officer is interacting face-to-face with somebody on the street. So it's really a matter of incorporating the principles of community engagement and community policing into what it is that SPD is doing. They also need to develop this is the data analysis piece we spoke about earlier, the fourth bullet here. And that is they're not currently doing a very good job of that. And I'm not going into greater detail because I think we've hammered that enough. Next, you got it already. The ability to be able to provide data to the community so they can inform themselves. When, if the only way a community member is going to be able to hear what the crime data is by going to a homeowners association meeting or going to a neighborhood committee meeting or something like that, that's probably not where most agencies are that are seen as being really progressive. A lot of agencies are posting that stuff in real time, maybe on a weekly basis or something like that, so that communities can educate themselves. For example, even in my own agency where I came from, we posted that stuff routinely. And we found that when we were going to the community meetings, no longer were we being told or asked, how come we've got this hardcore auto burglary program? Because we would then be telling them, or they would say we have a hardcore auto burglary problem in our neighborhood. And then we would try and explain to them based upon our data that we kept, well, the reality is you haven't had an auto burglary here in the last 6 months. So the real problems you have here are X. We don't get those questions, or we weren't getting those questions anymore when the community itself could take a look at the thing, the data on the website and know, oh, okay, I guess that's not the issue, so I'll ask about this. There's just so many benefits that come from sharing that information to the extent that they can, that we really think there's all kinds of opportunity for them to be able to leverage social media platforms to be able to do that. And as well, as you can see from the second bullet, they can use that information in their own programs. If I'm a director of a youth program or something, I see that I can look at the heat map of what's going on with youth crimes. I'll know where I need to put my resources to try and impact that. Also, clarifying the vision and the mission and the value statement for the police department. So it's very, very clear up front that the key thing for Salem PD is to make sure that everyone with whom they interact is being treated equitably and fairly, I think is important. It's not that some of their things don't say that within their mission statements, but there's a national effort across a variety of different professional policing organizations to make that front and center. It may seem like a trivial thing, but the report spells out why it's important to do that. Clearly also, formal process for identifying how they're going to diversify the department. But recognizing that they'll only really succeed if they're working with the community to do that. Next slide, Bob. And that gets us to the next one too. It's not just that you're trying to sync up with the BIPOC community and other members of the community to try and engage with recruiting or hiring or crime or anything like that, but just the relationships that you have. We find that those cities that really pay attention to this all of a sudden find an increase in applications for their department from the very diverse members of the communities that they're hoping to get. So again, it's establishing a relationship that can then be leveraged to do all of these other things that we're talking about in the report. It was very clear also that there are some very, there's a specific need to develop formal protocols for the officers responding to the crowd control situations so that it's in writing about how they should be interacting with all the groups out there so that there is not this perception that one group is being treated differently than another. We just heard so much of that from the community that even if it's not true, maybe officers aren't very verbal about explaining what they're trying to do in the moment, why they may be protecting this person's First Amendment rights, at the same time somebody else is trying to have theirs protected. But if that perception exists or people feel that that's what the PD needs to, or is doing, then you need to have protocols and training to make sure they're taking steps to both communicate what they're doing, why they're doing it, and or being able to explain that to somebody that's asking them on the street. We heard some really great things from some of the members of the community, especially the BIPOC community, that they're willing to participate and assist the department in the training that they roll out to address a variety of different things like cultural diversity, impartial policing, de-escalation, policing, constitutional-based policing, all of these different things. They're actually willing to say, hey, if you've got a 2-hour block on cultural diversity, why don't you give us 30 minutes? We'll come down, we'll teach it with you, hand in hand. We'll co-teach it. That not only helps the officers hear firsthand from different members of the community what their thoughts and their feelings are, but it pays a huge dividend when the community knows that they're being heard and their leaders are in those training sessions with the police department. Some of them said that they've done that actually. There were a couple that said they used to do it there at Salem PD. So it's not like Salem hasn't done that at some point in the past, but to the extent of what's happening right now, we weren't hearing that from the community leaders with whom we were interacting that's taking place. And then obviously collecting data, we think, again, that data collection could go a long way in helping the department understand if there are disparate outcomes in neighborhoods based upon enforcement action. And that doesn't mean that just because there may be a disparate outcome in a certain sector of the city, that means people are racially biased. There could be all kinds of social explanations for why there may be a higher response to this type of crime in this neighborhood versus this neighborhood. For example, there could be 10 times the number of 911 calls from a given neighborhood. But you can't manage what you're not measuring. And you can't just say, well, yeah, there could be disparate outcomes, but that's because of some of the reasons I just gave you. You've got to be able to help your community understand why you're doing what you're doing from a position of knowledge. And they're not currently doing that with some of their data, or their data is not allowing them to do that. Next slide, Bob. I think it's the last slide we have for our recommendations. Well, as a matter of fact, that is the last slide. And it's, again, we hope we haven't, just blasted this out in such a shotgun manner that you're not that you weren't able to get the highlights of what we're trying to share with you. But we'll open up the floor right now to see if you do have questions. It will be as responsive as we can.
Yeah, Rob. So I don't know if this is the right forum. I go back to the last slide that you were on, and I'll be the first to say that perception is reality when it comes to what we're doing. But as a learning organization, I think it's really important for us to understand, as you took a look at the issues associated with the protests, particularly, was there evidence, or did you find anything that we can learn from that would identify an actual disparity in how those things were handled?
Yeah, I think what you'll find, I would really refer you to what we were going to be writing in the report. And we do give some detail about what we were hearing specifically from the community members. And some of it, when you read it, may ring true. You may have already heard some of these complaints yourself, or you may have heard these from officers sharing what it is that they were hearing from people on the street. But I think the mere fact that, if you see these, you'll know immediately what it is that what the concern is. For example, you know, there could be people out there that were to protest, and people could observe that some people were being told, leave the area, leave the area. And then as they were leaving the area, they didn't hear or see anybody telling the other group, leave the area. So just something as simple as that was creating this consternation that, wow, they're supporting these individuals. Some of them were saying that they saw the officers giving hand signs or waving, or, you know, I didn't hear, and I'm not suggesting that there were any thumbs up to another group or anything like that. But there were subtle body language things that people perceived as indicating that they were on the side of the other group. So it's maybe subtle things like that, but obviously that's something that's trainable, that a police department has the capacity to be able to help officers understand, you know, these are the things that they're seeing, these are the things they're hearing, this is what you can be doing to prevent that. And also, here are ways that you can explain if somebody asks you on the street why you're doing this or not doing that. It could very well be, for example, that they were telling one group to leave because they were 10 times the size, and then they would turn and try to deal with that smaller group. You know, they don't always understand what the strategy may be from a command situation. But again, if having a capacity for a supervisor, something to be able to meet with the leader and explain what they're trying to do, could mitigate a lot of that perception within the community. So more detail on the actual report, but we'd be happy to discuss that more with you.
Rob, I would say that two pieces. Obviously, the one, don't favor any groups, you know, but that's more of a policy statement. The second piece is exactly what you said about the perceptions. Recognize that there's perceptions on when you discuss something with one group and it looks like a friendly discussion and they're listening. It's different than with another group. So you got to really recognize those perceptions when you're out there.
If it's appropriate, this is Courtney, I would just interject. I found online is where we keep all of the past years of our community satisfaction survey. And I just pulled it down, and I could tell you that police separately in 2020, there were 72% of people who were very or somewhat satisfied with the service they were receiving. And that compared to an 84% in 2019 when we had grouped fire, ambulance, 911, and police. So just for context, that's the answer, Cindy.
You know, Courtney, it would be great if you could share that with us. Let's take a look at the report to see there may be, it may be valuable and objective to be able to compare and contrast what we were getting from the one survey with the larger community survey that was maybe a little bit more scientific, and add that as a paragraph or something in that section. But if we get that data from you, that's not a heavy lift for us.
No, it's very easy to share. It's on our website, so I'll just drop the link in an email. Thank you.
Perfect. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could stop sharing screen so we could all see each other and have a conversation about the remainder of the time we have available.
It'll just take me a minute to figure out how to stop sharing. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob, or Rob, Bob, and Robert is messing me up with your team. Thank you. I'm sure that's an everyday thing. But thank you, Rob, very much to you and your team that are here tonight, and those that are in your offices that have helped put this information together. Really helpful. I think we've watched it evolve over time, and glad to see how it's coming together so that we can start sharing the story as we move forward. But I want to go around the room and make sure steering team members have a chance to offer any input. What are your overall thoughts? Anything that's glaring and stands out for you? Any different approach or opinion that you have? Just like to hear from you.
I mean, I'll start. I'll say I've worked here coming up on 22 years, and I think the committee, or the audit group there, in a very short period of time, really figured out things that a lot of us already know. Like I said, and the reason I bring up staffing is it's been a frustration for years and years. When I was hired 20 years ago, the staffing ratio was, I think, a little better than it is now in officers per 1,000. So I myself have been part of a multidisciplinary team that I thought was very successful, but the entire time I was on it, it dealt with child abuse. I could feel I was leaving a void at the department because my spot is missing doing the other detective activities. So you guys have, I think, hit the nail on the head on several different areas. And I just hope that the staffing piece of it, especially since city council has asked for this, that they realize that, yes, there is a lot of work to do, but it's like running a relay with only 2 runners against all the other teams have 4. Like, man, why can't you guys compete? This is ridiculous. You know, and you're like, well, we're staffed at half the level of the national average. So, you know, you do have some hardworking folks here and a community that does care. So hopefully we can get together and figure some of these things out.
So I'm going to jump on right behind Scotty because I think what he said was very good. On top of that, identifying those things that our limited resources are being asked to focus on, that maybe, again, that multidisciplinary approach really, I think, helps us to free up some of those resources to do some other things, to engage in different ways. And I will tell you that in having conversations with the chief, we are anxiously awaiting going through the details and the recommendations in the report itself. There are so many things that you've highlighted that again, like Scotty said, you've reinforced the things that we already know. You pointed out in ways that we can hopefully build off of and use that as a springboard to start moving forward, and then see what kind of commitment we get from other agencies, other service providers around the city that are going to help us move this forward, because we're not going to do it alone. And it's going to be through the efforts of council. It's going to be through the efforts of the organization. It's going to be the efforts of the other service providers within the city.
Yeah, thank you both very much. I just want to say real quickly that I hope that this is a new opportunity, a forward approach, where those of us even sitting around the room, I don't know if this has happened before, where we have this kind of conversation. So I think that you have many partners in your go forward approach. And I hope that, for example, as they talk about the surveys, the staff surveys, that we've given some baseline tools that you could use next year for your staff, or engage. I realize just over half the staff participated in the surveys. I might be off on the numbers. Is there a way that you can engage with the staff that didn't, so that they make sure that they're engaged and we really show each other that we're interested in helping each other out through this process? But thank you both for being frank. I appreciate it.
Chair, if I might also very briefly, I failed to ask if Ricky or Brian had anything to add that we may have missed. I just wanted to give them an opportunity if there's something that you need to hear that we may have missed, as Bob and I were doing most of the talking. Brian or Ricky, anything?
I'll add one thing, Bob. Sorry, Ricky. Just maybe to Scotty and Deputy Chief Burks. I think me and Ricky both were surprised at the amount of collateral duties officers were taking on that they weren't officially assigned because of staffing issues. So we were surprised to see just how much extra the officers are doing. So I think that's certainly a testimony to, you know, the working with what you have, realizing the strains on the department. The second part is that wasn't on the list earlier. We did talk to your Parks and Rec people, to your Public Works people, and some of the other community services. And I didn't hear any, and I think Gretchen, you were on the Parks call. I didn't really hear any conflict between city agencies. And Gretchen, you can, if I misquoted that, but I think everybody, I think, is a little frustrated, not only because of the lack or limited services or staffing, but for COVID. And I think everybody is ready for the pandemic to be done, because most of my interviews with the department staff was, well, do you want me to respond pre-COVID or post-COVID? So I think they're feeling the, you know, the strains and pressures as everyone else is. But yeah, Gretchen, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but did I quote that right as far as those conversations?
You did. And I just might say the times when I have heard from departments, it's been like, I want more of them. Like what speaks to Scotty's point about staffing ratio. It's like, I wish they were more available to come and help us with this situation in a quicker fashion. It just speaks to that workload issue, not a lack of quality or capability or willingness, but just workload.
So Ricky, and then I know Cindy has her hand up.
I just real quickly say I agree with Brian. I mean, the amount of passion and commitment that I saw from the community groups, it was equally from the police department, I mean, doing more with less, they've done a really good job with the collateral, but it also keeps them from doing a lot of the things that you also want to see in your community because of that. And just one real quick note, we've really hammered on the data collection part of it, and there are some real issues there you will see, but I will say that recently the department just got a brand new records management system, computer-aided dispatch, also within their internal affairs, a new way to track cases. So as they start to learn how to use these better and also become more with the other county agencies, I think there's going to be a lot. What I guess I'm trying to say is there's a little bit of good news on the horizon with regard to that as they start to learn to use the systems and be able to use them to their capabilities. Some of the issues like with the CPRB wanting certain stats, you're going to start seeing, I think, more of the things the neighborhood association leaders want to see with regard to crime maps. The ability is there. So, I mean, they have taken a step forward in that regard.
Thank you. Cindy, please.
I wanted to highlight the one area that the community was asking for. And clearly, you know, the department, I think, has done a great job in this, but it goes back to staffing as well. That whole collaboration idea, the MOUs and MOAs on, we would like to work on this, and we, the community, take on this responsibility, and you, the department, take on this responsibility, and we're going to measure our work that we're doing so that we can achieve this result. I think that's equal buy-in, that's equal commitment to move forward. I know in my 15 years of drug prevention years ago that we had multi-jurisdictional collaborations all the time. And I know in one of our community meetings, when we talked with the homeless youth and youth service agencies, they talked about working on an MOU, and that it was rewriting the MOU, that we've had these for years, but now we're readjusting this. And so I think that that's a piece of work that clearly the department is used to. But I think it's great that the community has said we want to be involved so that we can move some other things forward. And then we have to measure it. I mean, you mentioned that we'll put measurements in there, but if anything we move forward, we have to measure, because if you don't measure, then you don't know where you started or where you went and how you got there. And there will be times when you're going to have to check and adjust. We decided we wanted to do this. We got halfway down the road and said, that's not the right strategy. So you check, you adjust, and then you shift your strategy. And that's maybe when you rework those MOUs or rewrite roles and responsibilities. So I really liked that part. And then everything else, that's what we've been talking about for these last couple of months. So good report.
Great comments. I appreciate that. In fact, you know, Horace Greeley, was he the one that said go west, young man? Well, be a little more specific. Washington, Oregon, could you give me a little bit more specificity? We need a roadmap. We need to know what the points are along the way to get where we want to go.
I think we do a really good job as a community saying we want more, but we don't talk about that trade-off, and that we're at the point where trade-offs mean something doesn't happen. We can't keep squeezing. Levy, did you raise your hand earlier?
Yeah, I think my comment goes with what you were just saying, and also Cindy, and I think Casey's earlier comment. To help all of that, I think it would be helpful to have a version of the findings or recommendations prepared in a way that's very easily accessible to the average community member, so that they can pull that out and say, yeah, I understand what's going on here, what is expected of us as community members, but also what I'm going to be following up on. I think we have to give our city as much detail as necessary, and I have every confidence that you're going to do just that. But I think for the average community member, that it would be helpful to have it presented in a more digestible way.
To that point, I believe, don't quote me, but I believe it may have been Denver that took our recommendations, and they not only had obviously police officers driving some of these recommendations, but they're actually members of these committees driving each recommendation from the community. And then there was, I believe it was Denver, there was a requirement where they had to report on those like quarterly, what the progress was on this number of recommendations. So there was huge value in doing that. I believe it was Denver, but I'm not positive.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you for that, Libby. Anyone else? Anne Marie?
Thanks. It's always hard to find the mute button. I really appreciate what you've laid out and the things. And I don't want to come across that critical towards the police. I just think even running a crisis center, keeping everybody on the same page and moving forward with the same goals is really hard to do. So that was my point with the strategic plan. It's just whatever we can do to make sure we have consistent information going across. Because we've just had great partnerships with Salem Police, and we're very excited to be able to participate in that. I really like the way that you've laid out the goals and the things that you found. I'm really looking forward to reading the whole report, but I really like the way you laid it all out.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Kirsten?
Yes.
I just going around the room, making sure you have an opportunity if you needed to comment or ask any questions.
No, I appreciate all the work that's gone into it, and I find I think a lot of it, kind of like what Scotty alluded to a little bit earlier, we kind of knew, but it's really interesting seeing it kind of put to paper, so to speak. So I think it'll be really informative on how we want to move forward as a community and a department. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Casey?
No, I think my questions have been answered at this point. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. Lieutenant Aguilar, I think it's Lieutenant, I don't want to say it wrong. I know that you staff support, but I just want to make sure that if you have any reflection that you'd like to offer, please do so.
No, I don't have any reflection. I know that other than just to say, and it kind of echo what DC Burke talked about, is that I think the feeling from the department is that we're excited to get the audit done and get those recommendations so that we can start moving forward, because I think people see it as that, as well as the new chief, kind of an opportunity for us to kind of reset and then move forward and try some of these ideas that I know that a lot of our folks have and make those a reality. So we're all just really excited to get it done. So we're excited to read it.
Great, thank you. And DC Burke, any last comments or reflections? Or
I must have had that look on my face. Actually, there are some other things that I'd like to talk to Rob about that have absolutely nothing to do with this particular process. If we could touch bases after the call here or the Zoom meeting. And then the only other thing that I would ask for, obviously this, with this being a public forum and meeting here and a PowerPoint that's now out there that I don't know if our council or anybody else has seen at this point, it'd be beneficial if we could maybe get a copy of that.
Yeah, we made sure that they, go ahead, Courtney, I see you.
Sorry, we had a little bit of a challenge. Our intent was to get a copy out as the meeting started to the mayor and city council, but unfortunately we had a little bit of a hiccup in technology. We plan to update the PowerPoint with all of the things. I think, Rob, you're keeping track too, but a reflection on the police accountability portion of the work that we were supposed to be doing, and then listing out some of those community groups and individuals that we may have overlooked as we were putting this together. So we'll be updating this a little bit tomorrow morning, and then certainly can share it out.
Thank you. Yeah, timing wise and the way that we are meeting now just causes a little interesting way of approaching it, but we'll get there. Most important just to start sharing.
Quick point that might be helpful if somebody's wanting to peek and scan over the evening until tomorrow, it is live on YouTube, and you'd be able to go to the City of Salem Public Meeting channel and just kind of scroll through and watch this meeting, and you'll be able to visually see the document as well, in case that helps as a reference tonight.
Great, and I just want to wrap around the table. Scotty, any last items, reflections, comments?
Nope. I mean, I think no one really mentioned I really appreciate the youth outreach. I felt that we're missing a huge opportunity with the police department. We don't have a police activities league. We don't really sponsor youth activities or youth extracurricular, events. to the level that we could. We do a very small amount, but I'm glad that the audit will shine some light on that. I think that's a huge, huge area that we have a void in. So that's my last comment.
I was struck by Levy's comment, and we're going to put together strategic plans, documents, and maybe we could do one for youth from the police on their strategic plan for youth in the community, and help talk more directly to them, or hopefully we'll get some more ideas of that come through the work sessions that are coming up. So thank you. And Cindy.
I think I've said my piece. Great work. I mean, it definitely highlights everything that we've talked about throughout these last couple of months. It's good to see it coming together, and I can't wait to see the actual formal report with it all lined out with, here's the finding and these are the recommendations to move things forward, put it more tactfully and into some strategic direction. It'll be great.
Thank you, everybody. Anybody I missed that wanted to comment or talk before we talk about next steps and dates that are coming up?
Jody.
Oops, please. Ryan, we haven't heard from you tonight.
I just want to say one quick, I want to make sure we acknowledge Courtney and Lieutenant Aguilar. I mean, without we had their personal cell phones. If there was ever a glitch, if there was ever a document, and I think I speak on behalf of the whole team, was pretty amazing and incredible on the responsiveness, because I know I couldn't have got what I needed, and I'm sure Ricky and the rest of the team, without their quick response to texts and calls and requests. So they were pretty amazing. So thank you for those two individuals, and I know you all contributed, but they just did an awesome job.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And Chief, I'm happy to give you a buzz. I think I've got, I see it. I've got your cell number. So would you like me to call you tonight, or you want to do that some other time?
Tonight would be great.
I'll call you right after the meeting.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So thank you all very much for that discussion. We next steps, dates for your calendar. March 11th, we'll have our next steering committee where we'll have the final document before it goes to our joint work session. And we'll have any last thoughts and any new information that's come up that we'll discuss at that meeting. We'll also talk through on March 11th how our joint work session will happen, what the expectations are. So I believe, Courtney, tell me if I'm wrong, the expectations for the joint work session is for all of us, the steering team, to be there along with City Council on the 15th.
Yes, please. We'd greatly appreciate your presence and contributions. Work sessions, if you're familiar with City Council meetings, just know that work sessions are very different. The intent is for the City Council to talk to each other and amongst themselves, and the joint work session gives you an opportunity to share your experience of this process and the findings and the recommendations. So it's while it has the formality of Robert's rules, it's really more of a conversation opportunity. So we'll do some kind of a high level review of the findings and recommendations and the work done. And then it's really their chance to ask questions and you to ask questions of them and have an engagement. We start always at 6. So just make a note that it would be 6 o'clock, a work session on the 15th, and you'll get a link to that meeting in advance, promise.
Thank you. And then the community briefings for March 16th, 17th, and 18th. I suppose sometime before our March 11th meeting, there'll be information sent out to the community on those, or how will those actually work?
Yes, I'm scheduling them now, and they're not quite as pinned into that week that we identified. So I think we'll be rounding out some of those conversations through the last week of March. If you would like to mark your calendars now, you may. We are scheduled to present some of the findings and recommendations to the Neighborhood Association Chairs Group on March 25th. That meeting typically starts around 5:30 in the evening. So if you want to make a note of that. I'm working with Ashley Hamilton, who had to leave, to organize a focus group of our social service providers. That's been set. And then Casey, do you want to speak to the NAACP meeting and whether that's going to be an invite for everyone to come, or however many is appropriate?
I can only speak to the date, which we have landed on March 18th for the NAACP meeting. That typically will be at 6 o'clock. And I'm sure that I could work it out that anyone who would want to attend for that would be able to do so.
Thank you. Thank you. And members, steering committee members may choose not to attend all. I mean, there are going to be many opportunities, but it would be important if everyone could come to the city council. I'm still working on business community wrap up, clergy and interfaith meeting, and then we're talking through how best to coordinate sharing the findings with the Community Police Review Board and the Human Rights Commission. So those are the primary groups that we're focusing on. They specifically asked for this follow-up, and so that's what we're doing now.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're about ready to adjourn. Unless someone has any last needs. Great.
Did you say you're still working on a date with Ashley for social services, or did I miss the date for that one?
I have a date, and it's currently March 24th. I'm not sure how I'm not sure how many steering committee members will be the right number to use. So I'm gonna try to put all of these dates together and then ask you guys to choose a couple, if that's okay.
And Courtney, with what Casey led for us earlier on having a way for individuals to reach out for comments, are we looking at a way to do that for feedback on the report as well?
The share your story link is still active, but we could certainly do that. And Levy, I appreciated your advice and suggestion to do a really easily accessible piece on the findings and recommendations, which of course we would also have translated. So that might be the right tool to sort of say, here's what we've learned, and here's how we're going to move forward. And then ask people at that point to provide any feedback that they wish.
Great, thank you. All right, so March 11th, March 15th for us as a group, and then there will be individual briefings that Courtney will get to schedule out to us at some point. It's a little more work for us between now and the end of March, but very promising, great work to be involved in. Thank you all very much. Best to you out there with your electricity, and I hope it all comes back on faster than it is, and hopefully we won't have any, well, I'm not even going to say it, anything happen between now and our next meeting, but